Welcome to My Big Safety Challenge, a podcast all about stories of safety leadership, presented by Dale Carnegie and the Board of Certified Safety Professionals.
Along the way, we meet various people in life that cause us to stop for a moment and think and help us, not necessarily tell us what to think, but cause us to say, let me ponder and let me think about where we're going. And the person we have today is that person. You've met him before, spent time with him. Please tell us a little bit about Keith.
Yeah, I would be happy to, Merle. So you're right. This gentleman, amongst the many people that I'm grateful to be close with, is one of the closest. And since the day I met him, has said multiple things and asked multiple questions that have paused and forced me to think and ponder. And one of the things I'm most grateful for is Keith is actually joining us in person, in studio today, so we get to be with him, fully present with him. And what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about ethical influence. We're going to talk about listening. We're going to talk about focus, amongst many other things. And this gentleman has given so much to me that I'm grateful that he gives to give and delivers so much for our audience and our listeners today. And we don't have as much time as I would hope that we had, or that I wish that we had, but we will do the best we can to give people a taste of Mr. Keith Mercurio and everything that he can bring to the table for the safety and health profession. So the companies that these folks represent today, they can lead sharper, they can listen deeper, and they can drive true change within their organizations. So grateful to have Mr. Keith Mercurio here with us today. Keith, good morning.
Good morning. Very grateful. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you. In fact, I would say, Merle, we just met last night in person for the first time. That would be maybe one of the most ideal impressions I would leave with somebody, would be the idea that not telling people how to think, but asking questions that maybe make them think a little more deeply or a little bit differently. So I'm really appreciative of that. Thank you. And Jason, it's always a pleasure. It's not my ideal setting with you, which would be the kitchen counter at my old place with my endless supply of whiskey and your endless supply of lemon water and deep conversations on facilitation and influence, which was how, Jason and I spent many years getting to really know each other and learn from each other as far as our passion for the art and science of influence. And so that's a little bit more of our backstory and why we've come to work together over our career as well.
We love the word influence, of course, through the Dale Carnegie organization, how to win friends and, yes, influence people. Your term, ethical influence, is all influence ethical, or how do you draw that line?
Yeah, I mean, John Maxwell said, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. But over the years, as I, really delved into this premise and started to study the way in which people, particularly in authority, get people to see their vision, fall in line, hold them accountable, all the typical terminology that you'll hear. I started to just look at it from a human perspective, and the reality was that most ways in which people were influencing were leaning into title and authority. They would use flattery to try to get people to want to work more closely with them. They might use manipulation. They might use subtle threats. They might use any number of traditional human, naturally developed means of getting people to do what you're asking them to do. Right? You'll hear people say, kill them with kindness, or what is it? Honey brings more bees, or whatever the hell that is. The point being that there's all these different methodologies of trying to draw people in or get people to do what you want them to do. And they're all taking methodologies. How do I get from others what I want from them? And the premise of ethical influence came, it's actually a term from Robert Cialdini when he talks about it in his book Influence. And it's like, how do you actually measure this premise, and how do you filter it so that you actually know that you're up to a higher good, a greater good? And that's where the two questions that I pondered and sort of came to be, I don't even know where they came from specifically, so I apologize if I can't cite the original source here, but the two questions that came to be when asking, like, what am I about to say? What am I thinking? What am I up to? Was, does it honor and does it serve? Does it honor this person and does it serve this person? And when run through those two filters, I in my own personal experience, I've rarely ever made a decision, if ever, that I was regretful of or didn't feel amazing about 24 hours later, a week later, a month later, years later. Now, it doesn't mean I got what I wanted, but when I remembered to speak to someone, speak with someone, or speak from a place of honoring and serving someone, I don't remember a time in which it didn't serve and honor both of us in the long term.
Now, in the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Carnegie talks very clearly. He said, if you use these 30 principles of human relations and you use them to manipulate, you are wrong. That is not the purpose of this book. And you use the word flattery. He said, if you use try to flatterize, that may not be a word.
Oh, it's a word. That's a great. I don't know if it's a word, Merle.
We just made one.
Flatterize is outstanding.
If you flatterize,
yes,
shame on you. That's not right. What he did say was there's a principle, arouse in the other person an eager want. Because he says every one of us, that what we do it ultimately because we want something. We envision an end in mind. And when you talked about those two questions you use, he would say, think about when you're in a situation and you're trying to guide people to make a decision. Stop and say, what is it that they want that I can help them get to and guide? How does that fit in with what you're thinking?
The idea of guiding is a really beautiful principle. One of the areas that I see this conflict come about is in, early stages in sales or in leadership. You start to learn that you should be asking questions. But like one of the things that you'll hear is, there's a few catchphrases or phraseologies within leadership that really make me bristle. And one of them is when you hear people say, you have to ask people questions so they think it's their idea. And this is one of those classic unintentional manipulations, right? And I'm not saying anybody's up to no good here, but the premise is I've got an idea and I'm going to ask you questions until you discover my idea as your own idea. And so people will ask questions like, well, would you agree? Or don't you think? Or is it fair to say? And if you're asking any question that starts with those phrases, those are not questions. Those are your opinion with a question mark at the end that you are forcing somebody to fundamentally agree with. And that's what leading questions look like. And so one of the principles that we work with leaders on is learning to ask guiding questions. And guiding questions they're not just going to be wide open, loose cannon questions where people can go anywhere, but they're thoughtful in that they guide the conversation, but they come from a genuine place of curiosity. And so, like one of the things that I think is just critically important is you'll hear people talk about, well, you got to make people feel heard. And this is another one of those phrases that I think is really dangerous because you can't make people feel anything. And you could make somebody or have a better shot at making someone feel heard, but not actually hear them. And so we say, don't worry about making people feel heard. Just ensure that they are heard. And then let them feel what they're going to feel. And so, this idea is we ask guiding questions, which are open-ended. Hey, what are a couple of ideas you have that would, create a safer environment while not impacting, our safety standards? Right? Not negatively impacting our safety standards. You might ask a question like that, right? And, so you see that it's guiding, right? It puts up some guardrails around the question. So it gives framing and context to allow the person to understand what we're asking. But then we're going to be genuinely curious about what they have to say. And a lot of leaders will ask a question like that, and they'll say, well, what we really, then they hear the answer, and the person says, well, what we really need to do is, we need to take people's safety, more seriously, or something like that. Or, y'all need to invest some money. And immediately the leader wants to get defensive. Well, we invested this money. If you're going to really ask, really ask.
So he asked, but then when he didn't get the answer he wanted, all of a sudden he
because if there's not genuine curiosity there, you have to ask with courage and curiosity. So this idea of guiding questions, you ask with courage and curiosity. And the courage comes from the willingness to hear that something the courage comes from the place of being willing to have your mind changed, right? And have that person actually have a superior idea to you or yours. To be, we call it influential questioning, not because of the way that it influences the other, but because of the willingness to be influenced by the power of what comes out of the conversations.
Well, now that's a different twist. Because Jason, when you think about how we commission the average safety professional. The average safety professional is implied. You go keep everybody safe. They don't say it just like that, but that's kind of the implied role. But you're saying this a little bit different, that it's not that I'm just trying to only influence you. Can we do something where I'm the one I potentially could be influenced, and we're opening it up for you as an individual, an employee, a worker, to help give ideas to influence us in the whole? Is that we're going in the right direction, or have I missed
For
it?
sure, yeah. I mean, there's some great examples of this, because I think people start to get anxious about, the idea of opening up the floor to everybody's ideas. And I think that's fair. It can be, early in my career, I was in rooms full of, technicians and professionals in the trades and things like that. And you would open up a question to the floor and things could go haywire pretty quickly. You get, one session could turn into, just a series of complaints about the company, or, ideas that aren't really, the best ideas, or particularly additive or helpful. So when we do this, we have to be willing to, create the context, the framing for successful and value additive conversations, for sure. The quality of the question matters a lot. If we say something like, what ideas do you guys have? That's not a particularly good question. But if we say, hey, take a moment, I want you to reflect over the last month. What were 3 moments where you saw and felt that your that your ability to do your job freely was being encumbered by safety standards that you didn't understand or agree with? Right? Now, that's a very different question, right? We're going to get people to explore, or I guess in that almost a command, but we're going to get people to explore their own experience. We've given them context, like give me 3 examples, so having them go a little bit deeper. We've given them really beautiful framing around the question, right, where it can be experiential. And now we have the opportunity to learn from that. They don't necessarily have to have the idea how to fix it. But by asking them their own experience, which we can't argue with, right? We can't argue with somebody else's experience. We can really learn from it. And now we're going to listen. Now, they may say something that, we disagree with, or maybe they were out of protocol and, we can tell. That's not the point. Like, this is about genuinely asking people questions to learn from them. And then from there, being able to take and reflect and bring maybe your best ideas on how can I now respond to that, not in that moment per se, although maybe, but how can I respond to that with, a way of making improvements that'll improve the quality of their life and their work.
So, Keith, tell me a little bit about this. I've been told before that if we ask questions that people have heard before, it doesn't trigger any original thought. But if we ask new, novel questions, it forces new and novel thought. And for example, if we ask our workers, do you have any safety concerns? Not a lot of thought went into that question in the first place, and they've probably heard that question 100 or 1,000 times. But the question that you just referenced, that's new and novel. I've never heard that question. So what's the power and what's the impact of asking really thoughtful questions that maybe people haven't heard before?
What you're saying is so important. Getting away, there's two things I think that are really important to avoid in communication. George Bernard Shaw said that the problem with communication is the illusion that it took place. And when we say something like, what safety concerns do you have? Do you have any safety concerns? And they say no. And then something comes up on the floor or whatever else, and we have an incident, then there's this whole idea like, well, I asked them, if they had any concerns. They said no. Leaders have to understand that asking questions like that, it's not only is it ineffective, it's borderline irresponsible, because you're not creating an environment that really elicits thought, original thought, inspires novel thinking, new ideas. So, Tony Robbins says, that the quality of your life is in direct proportion to the quality of the questions that you're asking. And the same goes for your leadership. So we have to be really careful of asking standard questions that have been asked a million times. Certainly, do you questions, yes or no questions, or they can be helpful when we're just wanting to pivot in a conversation. Does that make sense or no? Great, fine. But really, we want to be asking open-ended questions, who, what, when, where, how questions. You'll notice I leave why off the list because typically when we ask why, we're almost always forcing somebody into a defensive posture. They're going to have to justify. So be really thoughtful about deploying the word why in your questions as a leader, as a human. Why did you do that? Why do you think that? You're basically asking somebody to defend themselves. Not necessarily intentionally, but that's the way that it's experienced. So asking those open-ended questions, putting some framing around it, giving a specific number to, give me 2 or, 3 examples, things like that are really helpful in creating novel questions that will elicit novel thinking. Additionally, we have to be really careful as leaders and influencers to not use common phrases, known quotes and phrases. So, back to the premise of the illusion that communication is taking place. You'll hear leaders talk about accountability all the time. It's one of my least favorite words in leadership. One of my least favorite words because it's a word that everybody nods their head at. Yep, accountability, got to hold people accountable, whatever that means. And so now everybody's nodded their head, but with their own understanding of what it even means. No absolute clarity that we've got a shared definition of what would accountability look like. What does accountability act like? What does it sound like? And so when we use these known phrases and we think we've struck a common agreement, that's the most dangerous place we can be in. Because now we walk out of the room with both of us having agreed to something, but only based on our own experience of that concept or content. And so it's a really, like learning to then ask those next questions if you're going to use the phraseology, so what would accountability look like in a scenario like this? Okay, like how often might you check in with that person? And when you check in with that person, would you be telling them about where they're at, or would they be reporting to you? And you can, I don't have an opinion on that. You can convince me it's one way or the other, so therefore it's not a leading question. But it's actually walking down that road with somebody to make sure that we are truly understanding and speaking the same language. Now, I'll just add one more piece. Long answer to a really good question, elicited a lot of thought, is if we can start to use original phrasing, we're likely to, at bare minimum, elicit a little bit more curiosity. So, for example, I say, I don't believe in accountability. I believe in systems of accountability that inspire personal responsibility. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it's really systems and operational excellence, in my mind, that create organizational accountability. Weekly one-on-ones, quarterly goal setting, along with an expression typically, within a group of how well we did compared to what our goal was. having weekly scorecards where we review with people how effectively we hit the markers that we were, guiding towards. Look, we're creating tribes inside of a business. That's what we are. We're tribal people. We want to fit in. We want to be successful within the tribe. So when we set up team-oriented goals, individual metrics maybe within those team-oriented goals, and then we come together and we have to express whether we hit our markers or not with shame, not with public condemnation, just literally reporting on it. What is that? That's a system of accountability. What does it do? It inspires personal responsibility, because within that, I don't want to come into the meeting with my peers that I value deeply at a table that I'm really honored to get the chance to sit at and report 3 weeks in a row that I haven't hit my markers. So it's a system that inspires personal responsibility. Right? Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's a significantly more valuable premise than going and telling someone, well, you got to hold people accountable.
Which seems very vague.
Right. Yeah, it is vague. And by the way, it almost always has to do with what do you do? Like, accountability is almost always the repercussions of not getting your job done. Nobody talks about accountability from the reward system, from the positive. Yeah. What you got?
Yeah, so, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. It actually leads me into, there's a speaker in our space, very thoughtful, very brilliant speaker, and he says, before an incident, that's when we should be speaking about accountability. After an incident, our focus should always move towards learning. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, who is that? Do you have the name?
Yeah, it's Dr. Todd Conklin is his name. He's an author, speaker, brilliant man.
No kidding. I mean, that's a beautiful framing. It's the same way I feel about like critical feedback. Don't give it in the moment after the thing has already taken place. You're just going to pierce somebody, and give space and time to critical feedback. I say, unless somebody's about to get hurt or the building's going to burn down, you don't need to give critical feedback in the moment. You don't need to have punishments in the moment. You don't have to, like, those are almost always done to make people feel like there was a consequence. Well, the consequence was whatever went wrong. Now, I'm sure that there's a million folks out there in the legal space or whatever else that would have different reactions to this. I'm not interested in the legality of what takes place in this life so much as I am, the influence and whether we're honoring and serving people. And so when I look at leadership, I don't get wrapped up in the idea of like a right and a wrong way. In fact, I think that's a really dangerous concept, and a really, well, frankly, ineffective concept. And so instead I move into like, is it effective or ineffective? And very rarely are punishments, holding people accountable, significant consequences after an incident, very rarely do those do anything to inspire a more successful, healthy outcome and culture after. Comparatively, the willingness to humble oneself and learn, right? That's what that's about is, I mean, if we move it over to the human side and the human equation, that's about regret and remorse. And, I think, Jason, you and I have talked about this in the past, but like regret and remorse, those are learning emotions. Those are, if you get into any sort of, therapy or, psychology work, you might hear clean versus dirty emotions. Regret and remorse are considered clean emotions in the fact that they live in the heart and they're ways to learn and think about how I could do things differently in the future. Whereas shame and guilt are considered like dirty emotions, and those live in the gut and they're about what I should have done differently. And if you notice, anytime we're using the word should or shouldn't, we're not bringing learning into the equation. We're bringing judgment into the equation. And, I think what you see a lot of leaders react to is the need for there to be some sort of consequence, which is born out of this idea of shame and guilt, which is about what should have been done differently. And as a result, that leaves all of it in the past. and doesn't bring the learning forward into what could I do differently now moving forward from this learning space. So, Conklin, good stuff right there.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate you going and giving your perspective and then bringing in the human side of things on that with the clean versus dirty. There's another thing that you said around common phrases, I'll say cliches and common phrases. And we are proficient in our profession at times at using cliches and common phrases, such as, safety first. Such as we need to send people home in the same condition in which they came. So what's the danger, whether we're in safety and health or whether our operational leaders are using common phrases and cliches such as that? What's the potential impact of that?
Yeah, so known phrases, right? So known phrases, common phrases, cliches, whatever you want to call them. The problem with a known phrase is that it's known. And knowing is the least productive state for learning. So you cannot learn something which you already know. So when we use a known phrase, all we're doing is eliciting that person's already state of what their relationship with that phrase is. So we're not eliciting any new thinking. In fact, we're eliciting their old thinking to wherever they used to hear that phrase. And now if you actually think about it, it's really interesting because safety first might have been something that their mother said to them, when they were growing up. And I'm not saying they're actually meant, consciously thinking about this. We got to understand 99% of human behavior comes out of the non-conscious. It comes out of our belief systems, our identity, our imprinting. It's not a matter of conscious thought and then decision. That's not how human beings work at all. And for those of you out there who think that you're the super logical, that you're the one that's operating with this ongoing consciousness, that's your own belief system that's filtering your own understanding of yourself. So all of us are under the same fog of our imprinting. It's just a matter of, I think, how deeply we start to delve into it and understand why we think the way that we think. So for most people, they'll have, if it's a common phrase or an old phrase, there's either a tiredness to it, sort of an internal unexpressed eye roll, or maybe even an actual eye roll, or there's the potential that it's just actually eliciting something from their past that maybe they do or don't have a positive association with. They might have had a coach that used to say something and they didn't have a good season with that coach. That was the end of their high school basketball career, and they don't know why, but they just know when they hear that phrase, something in their body tightens up and they don't like it. So there's all these different ways that known phrases and cliches create old reactions in people. And you don't have control over what their old reactions are. I mean, we have to be careful of the illusion of control at all, I think, as human beings, certainly as leaders, and definitely as safety professionals. Y'all are control freaks. And
he knows our tribe well.
Oh, my God. We'll get into those people. Well, you know what? No, let's do it right now. I'll just say, I just want to remind, the safety professionals out there, your beautiful brains are wired to see what's wrong. Okay. And I love that about you. Thank you for that. And the fact that you see what's wrong doesn't stop when you leave the job site. This is how the people in your life are experienced. This is how the circumstances in your life are experienced. Like, just a heads up out there to our safety pros who are trying to control every outcome and avert every, danger and see what's wrong in all scenarios. Like that self-awareness is something that needs to be evolved and developed. Yeah.
Keith, that sounds so good, though. I've got to be alert to the problems. What is the end result and byproduct of having that perspective along the way?
Yes, could be, it's great that you would be watching for what's wrong. That's your superpower. We're not asking you to be any different. And certainly you're not going to make your mind work particularly different. Like, you're pretty fixed being. Once you're past the age of 8, you're a pretty fixed being. And so it's just a matter of, as we evolve self-awareness and evolve our ability, and that's what, ethical influence falls into 4 categories: awareness of self, influence of self, awareness of others, and influence of others. And when I coach and teach and speak from stage on this topic, it's everything lives within those 4 quadrants. It's the idea that everybody should see the world the way you see it. It's the idea that this stuff is obvious. It's the idea that this stuff is right. It's that what you see is right, or the way that our protocols are right. That's a really dangerous mindset. Additionally, when it comes to, talking about the idea of how, people, I shouldn't look at what's wrong. Well, you can focus on what could go wrong. That's fair. Okay. And I think that that's important for identifying danger. But you have to be really careful about speaking to what you don't want. Okay. And so,
why?
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe you. Why?
So the premise is that what you focus on, you find. What you focus on grows bigger, and what you focus on, you become. And this isn't just a philosophy, it's a science, and it's the reticular activating system of the brain. And so the reticular activating system is this phenomenal mechanism that lives, deep in the limbic system in between and in concert with the amygdala. And what it has to do with is like the non-function or the non-conscious function of the body. So for example, it's responsible for blinking, breathing, heartbeat, all the, millions and millions of functions of the body that we could never consciously think about. But it also has this kind of remarkable role in that its job is to filter what information makes it through to the conscious mind. So the non-conscious is processing 11 million bits of data per second. Right, the non-conscious being the total, the non-conscious as we understand, because we got to get really clear: the mind and body are inextricable. They're one thing. They're not 2 separate entities. And so, 11 million bits of data per second being processed by the non-conscious. Meanwhile, the conscious mind is capable of processing at most 50 bits of data per second. And so, this reticular activation system is responsible for deciding what of the 11 million makes it through to the 50. All right, so like the best example I can give you of this thing functioning that most people can relate to is whatever car it is that you drive and bought and shopped for. Merle, what do you whip around?
Toyota.
Oh, which one?
A Camry.
Toyota Camry. Well, this is the occasion in which this analogy doesn't work at all, because you do in fact drive one of the most common cars on the road in America.
I have an example. I think that goes with
yeah.
Years ago, we knew we needed a bigger vehicle because our family was getting one. It was getting bigger. And we went to the store or a dealer and test drove a Ford Aerostar minivan back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never noticed one before.
Right. And then what
after
happened?
that, they were everywhere.
Right. We see them everywhere. And if you learn a new song, you hear a new word, you develop a new language. Somebody mentions a book that you'd never heard of, and then somehow that book pops up, later that day, and I just learned about that. This is the reticular activating system at work, because what we've done is, by focusing on something, becoming intensely focused, feeding the brain something, we're telling the reticular activating system, hey, want you to keep on the lookout for this thing. And so the reticular activating system, when you started shopping for Aerostars, which, man, that's some good early 90s stuff right there.
Back in the dark ages.
Yeah, that's some good early 90s reminiscing right there. What happened was your brain decided, because there was enough focus on it, hey, this must be really important to this guy. So we're going to make sure he doesn't miss a Ford Aerostar on the road. And suddenly they start appearing almost like you're summoning them. Well, think of the implications of this. This goes for everything in our lives. That whatever we focus on, we find grows bigger and we become. And so, this is fundamentally what this is the natural human algorithm. So if you think about the way that, now online, whatever you search for, you're suddenly fed a bunch of ads, whatever it is that your your interests are, tends to populate on your screen. It'll gather up in your Instagram, your Facebook, whatever else. Well, that's the manual, developed algorithm of artificial intelligence and the internet. But prior to that, for millions of years, human beings have been operating under our own algorithm, which is the reticular activating system, which is gathering information to support our existing beliefs and to bring into focus evidence that supports those things. And so as a result, whatever it is, this is where cognitive bias comes from. And if we don't understand that we're all a function of cognitive bias, then we are in real trouble. If you think that it's other people who are biased and not you, you're really in trouble, because that's just how the brain works. It's how the mind works. And so whatever we're feeding it, we are then telling it to go find more evidence of that thing. And so when we focus on people, on problems, right? And that's okay. It's okay, but we have to then understand the implications of that if we don't then look at how we frame it and how we share it from a place of solution and creating the outcome we do want. And I think this is where I would say I see the single greatest flaw in the standard practices of the health and safety world. And it's this idea of focusing on zero. Zero preventable injuries, zero preventable deaths. And why? Because what we're focusing on is the very thing we don't want. And that is just an absolute psychological dissonance that can't exist. If I say, the famous example, I think it was Eckhart Tolle, don't focus on the pink elephant, right? Like, what does your brain do? It sees the pink elephant. Any golfer knows this if they've ever stood on a tee box. Like, just don't hit it in the water. Just don't hit it in the water.
It goes straight in the water.
That ball's going right to the water. I'm a skier. I ski in the trees. And when you first start skiing in the trees, you're terrified of hitting the trees. So what do you look at? The trees. And all you see is trees. And eventually, as you become a better skier, you start to look where you want to go, in between the trees. And then suddenly you go where your eyes go. You go where your focus goes. And the safety profession has decided that this idea of zero is the marker of success, as opposed to, what about the idea of 100? Like, what is it that we really want? And I mean, Jason, you talked about returning people in the condition that we found them. What about returning them in a condition better than the one we found them? What if we sent people home happier and healthier every day? What if that was our intentionality? And I just think that there's I get it, and I understand why. I get it. Zero's a great goal. It's a great goal. But it's not really what you want. You don't want zero. You want 100. And so focus on what you want, not what you don't want.
So let's say that I'm listening to this as a safety professional, and I say, oh, I've gotten in this rut of looking for the wrong. Where does a person start? How would you suggest a person starts to turn that ship?
Merle, you're pretty good at this, by the way.
Really?
This interviewing thing. Yeah. You're very good at this. It's a great question. It really is.
Because you got me out here. I've walked the plank. I'm about ready to go off the ship. But I said, I got to do something.
So the way in which we get to feed the reticular activating system is with intentionality. We're in trouble when we just allow life to come at us. And again, I don't want to, overstate the illusion that we can control what life is going to do. I mean, that's my ongoing discovery of 2024, and the illusion of control is a big part of my thinking, and not being overly prescriptive about this. But there's a few different ways that we can start to rewire the brain. And what we're doing, I love, you called it a rut. That's exactly what happens in human thinking. I mean, literally what it is neuropathways. So the more often we think a thought or feel a feeling, the more we fire a neural pathway. The more times we fire that neural pathway, the more myelin protein covers that pathway, and the stronger it becomes, the more accessible it becomes. And eventually, if it's a negative, we call it a rut. If it's a positive, we call it a groove. And my buddy Bobby Hamilton always likes to say, today's groove is tomorrow's rut. So be careful for that. But the idea is that, whatever we're naturally thinking, the synapses that are firing, they become very accessible to us. I believe, Jason, you introduced me to this study years ago, so I'm going to take a run at it, and you tell me if I got it right. I think human beings think something like 40 to 60,000 thoughts per day. Of those, 98% are identical to yesterday, and 80% of those are negative. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, it sounds accurate. And, sir, to cite a resource, UCLA, Resnick School of Neuropsychiatry, I believe is where that study came from. And yes, that is accurate from what I understand.
Yeah. And so that was, so when we think about that, we're naturally as human beings designed to see what's wrong. That's how we survived, right? Those are survival instincts. And so they're very helpful for survival. They're not very helpful for thriving. And so, thriving requires discomfort that is out of connection with the bare minimum to survive. And so what we can do as human beings is we can start priming our brains with new points of focus and intentionality to start to create new awarenesses that will come into view. And so like the most practical things that we can do is just set some intentions for the day. Like today I'm going to show up and I'm going to point out 5 things that people are doing well. Right? Yep. You want to stop me there?
Which is, if you think about when the average safety professional walks out on the floor, walks out to the work site, walks among the people, most people are saying, uh-oh, I wonder what they're going to say now, what they're going to point out. And when the person falls into that rut of the only time they talk to people is to say, hey, buddy, get that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Now, this like everybody's braced for the guy. You talk about the common routines and common patterns. They're braced for this guy and they avoid him, guy or gal. But now you're saying, what if we bust that?
Yeah. Well, 2 things just that you just elicited. One, when people walk into the room, energy moves, right? No matter what. I mean, we know this not just, from a spiritual perspective, but a metaphysical perspective. I mean, it's a very real thing. Energy moves. And you're either bringing energy or taking it. And if you're not sure, you're definitely the one taking it. Right? And so like, we can fall into those, those patterns where we walk in the room and people just, oh boy, right? Like the heads drop, the eyes divert. There's all of that. Well, it's probably because that's what you're bringing with you is negativity, criticism, criticality. Again, it's your superpower. I don't want you to feel bad about this out there. I just want you to understand the effect that it has because your job is to be influential. Your job is to send people home better than you found them, right? And so you have to be capable of relating to people in a meaningful way if you're actually going to protect them, if you're actually going to inspire them. So, another one, Jason, that you introduced to me there were 2 separate studies. One was done on healthy relationships. One was done on high-performing teams. And they both discovered that the magic ratio of positive to critical feedback was 5-1, right? 5-1 ratio. Now, for some reason, when people hear this, they always think that means that they need to say 5 complimentary things before they can drop their critical comment. That is not what I'm talking about. I think you look really good today, and you're mostly doing a good job, and I'm really happy that you work here, and I want to, but also,
but you suck.
Yeah, but also, that's not what I'm saying, folks. What I'm saying is if out of a sample size over a month period, that from you, an employee, a team member, a colleague, a wife, a husband, would have heard 5 positive comments for every 1 critical. Right? It's a ratio. It's not a formula. It's a ratio. So, to prime the mind, right? If I set out in the morning with some intentions, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find, 5 things that I want to point out that people are doing really well. I'm going to make it a point today to thank 3 people for something that they did last week, right? I'm going to make it a point today to, maybe walk into work with some intentionality and ask people how they are before I ask them for anything. Just setting some intentions is priming the reticular activating system. Super powerful. A little bit more, maybe personally minded, but critically important, maybe the most important when it comes to developing resilience would be a practice of gratitude. Sitting in gratitude for things that we have, that we've experienced, that we've discovered, good, bad, and different. Because gratitude is the foundational muscle of resilience. It's the ability to see what's good regardless of what's going on around us. And so if we want to become more meaningfully, effectively, and I'm careful about this, Jason. People start to confuse this with positive thinking. I do not believe in positive thinking. I believe in powerful thinking. And I think there's a critical distinction there. This isn't about making things seem okay when they're not. This is about powerful thinking that allows us to bring into focus that which will serve and honor us and others. And so, when people don't get a good night, sleep, I think, Joel, you said you've got one of our team members here. You had your baby's sick, right? And so you got a little viral infection. And so you were up late last night. You didn't get great sleep. I'm not going to ask you to pretend that you're full of energy today. That's just disingenuous. That's lying to ourselves. Yes. So how do we use language to shift our focus? What, Joel said to me, I didn't get a ton of sleep, but I got enough to have a great day. Okay? So he just did this on his own when I asked him about his night last night. So what did he do? He said the truth. I didn't get a ton of sleep. But now he used language really thoughtfully there, or powerfully. I don't know if he did it thoughtfully. I think he's naturally wired this way, or he's learned this, which is very impressive. I didn't get great sleep, but I've got enough to have a great day. Well, that's a remarkable statement, because what have you done? You've taken the truth, but also shifted to the truth that is more going to serve and honor the man, the day, the team that's depending on him. That's powerful stuff. And so we can be sick, but also be tough. We can be tired, but also be resilient. And so, how we frame our thinking, how we create our language allows us to find, the ability to summon our power through our language, through our focus, prime the mind, prime the reticular activating system. And now you've given it this subtle but critically important command to focus on. Acknowledge the tired, but focus on the toughness. Acknowledge the sick, but focus on the resilience. And now that's what you're summoning for the day.
So what if he had said, yeah, it was a terrible night of sleep. I hope I can make it through the day. I'm going to gut it out. Different
Exactly.
direction.
Yeah, you're creating a completely different narrative that's now running in the non-conscious throughout the day and informing the way we feel and think. I mean, this is science, folks. This is not just some philosophy. This is how the mind fundamentally operates based on the information that we're feeding it. And so, schema, the premise of all that we're absorbing, like this is why it's so important to have intentionality about what we're being fed, why the mindless scrolling can be so dangerous, why, whether news sources can be so dangerous, what we're consuming can really misinform the mind as to what reality looks like. And so we have to be thoughtful, and we have to be most thoughtful, in my mind, of the language we use, particularly when we speak to and of ourselves.
And Keith, when we think about even Dale Carnegie's principles, there are some of those that really, I believe, fit with what you're talking about here, about give honest, sincere appreciation.
Yes.
Become genuinely interested in the other person. Even remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. They love to hear their name. Be a good listener. Encourage other people to talk about themselves. And then one more, talk in the terms of the other person's interest. And then one more, to work to make the person feel important and do it with sincerity. And all of those sound like the kind of things you're saying. These are ways to approach as we're going through our day to set its activity we can do to influence us in the way we are and how we approach other people.
It's beautiful. Seems like you've really studied this stuff carefully.
Once in a while.
Carnegie stuff. Those are beautiful tie-downs to it. There's only one that I would just make a little note about.
Please.
The idea of making people feel important, just being careful about that. just ensure that they are important. Choose for them to be important to you.
And to do it with sincerity.
And let them, and then they'll feel what they're going to feel.
Yeah.
But just continuing to watch that tendency to try to make people feel anything.
Thank you.
Okay, as far as like what's my goal? Let me make sure that they are important to me.
Thank you.
They'll feel it, right? They'll feel it.
Join us next time for more of our conversation with Keith Mercurio.
Thanks for listening to My Big Safety Challenge, a podcast produced in partnership by Dale Carnegie and BCSP, with your hosts, Dale Carnegie Master Trainer Merle Heckman, and Jason Coons, Global EHS Team and Culture Activation Lead for 3M. Executive produced by Charlie Eltringham. Supervising producer and editing by Michael Escobedo. Directed by Michael Escobedo, Joel Burgai, and Giachi Liu. Graphics by Giachi Liu. Editorial support from Brendan Mohawk. Consulting producers are Colin Brown and Mark Sullivan. To have new episodes delivered directly to you, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. If you would like to share your story of a safety leadership challenge you faced, email us at info@mybigsafetychallenge.com. See you next time.